This is the third in a series of 5 seminars on the topic of structural insulated panels. So the first one and the second one are already recorded and put onto the YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen those, check them out. This one we're looking at pretty pictures, so it's about case studies on cold stores and freezers and elsewhere. So in this one, there's going to be no Mathcad, but we'll look at some drawings and details. Parts 4 and 5, oh yes, there's going to be lots of Mathcad in that one. So a reminder of the series. Part 1 was on tiny houses and modular buildings and what you need for resource consent and building consent. Part 2 was on calculating the structural capacity of the panels for roofs and ceilings, as well as walls and panel beams. Today, we're looking at cold stores and freezers and even a clean room as well. So how do we use these panels in commercial and industrial applications? Part 4, in 2 weeks' time, we're looking at how we calculate the capacity of the fixings, because the fixings are often the governing criteria. So we'll look at bolts, rivets and screws in steel to NZS 4600 and bolts, rivets and screws in aluminium to AS 1664. Part 5 will go into very much more detail on how we develop load span tables. I'll be using transform section properties because it's a composite material and looking at the structural capacity using matrices in Mathcad. So here's an example of a cool store. It looks remarkably like a typical warehouse. In this case, there are 3 cool stores side by side with a connecting chilled corridor in between. Outside, we have a canopy. Okay, nothing too exciting about that. And it looks like a typical warehouse building with a steel portal frame building. Only in this case, we have structural insulated panels as the cladding rather than the usual wriggly tin, as we call it. Here is a typical detail of the base and of the wall and the column. So it's a typical steel frame structure with a pad foundation. The only difference is the cladding. In this case, it's an insulated panel and how we fix it. So at the bottom, we put an aluminium channel and we can rivet the techno panel to that channel and screw that channel down into the concrete. Similarly, at the eaves, we've got a typical eaves beam. In this case, it's a channel, 2 channels back toe to toe, forming a box section. And we put a strap around that and connect through the panels. So these are M10 bolts going through the panel and connecting to our steel and tying it into the eaves beam. Here's a typical ridge detail. For this particular cool store, we didn't have an apex beam or a ridge beam. So the panels themselves are structural and they span together and make a connection at the roof. So there's some attention needed in here because in effect, when you get wind uplift, you're going to be tearing these panels apart under the wind load. Here's a typical wall to roof detail. So we've got a thicker roof on the top, sitting on a thinner wall underneath, and we simply put a little angle on either side of it. So here's a 40 by 40 by 1.6 aluminium angle, and we're fitting these with 4.8 lined rivets, and usually put them at 400 centers or centers to suit the loading as well. Here's a typical wall detail. So here is our wall panel, our SIPS wall panel. We have through bolts, and that's connected to a cleat, steel cleat, which hooks over the girt. So your girt in this case is a box section, an RHS girt. So this is what it looks like on the inside. Surprise, surprise, it looks like a big fridge. So panels, you'll see the joints in there. So we've got panels making up our walls and panels making up our roofs. And to that, we can add whatever we need to add. So services, lighting, and connections. Here is a detail of the underside of the roof. So here is our toe-to-toe channels forming a box section. and that acts as the purlin. So the SIPS panel sits on top of that with through bolts in there. So you'll see this particular building is in operation as we have pallets and pallets of fruit being chilled in the cool room. Another view of the same building, that we have our purlins coming into our main steel frame as well. So the racks go pretty much up to the eaves to hold these pallets of, in this case, fruit. And there's an awful lot of servicing going in these cool rooms and freezers. And so you can hang the air conditioning units and the air conditioning ducts, usually either directly off the panels or through spreader beams as well from the main structure. So this is what the structure looked like while it was being built, and it looks very similar to a typical steel-framed warehouse. The difference here is that we don't have a full frame on the gable end, as the panels are serving the purpose of the gable end supports. And you'll notice there's not a great deal of bracing. There's a little bit of bracing, high bracing in there, but our SIPS panels are forming the bracing panels for the building in the permanent condition. And that's what it looks like from the outside. Not very exciting, but it's functional. They're relatively quick to go up, and you end up with the finished product. So the panel, it comes with its painted and coated surfaces, so they can be cleaned. There's no need for additional painting. This is a different building, and this was a distribution centre, a rather large one for a food distribution warehouse. And so we have our staging area down here. In this size, we have a very large freezer. We've got quite a large cool room in here, and then a smaller, what they call a blast freezer, so that you can quickly freeze goods. This is what it looks like on ceiling plan. In case you can't see that, let's blow it up a bit. So you can see the panels spanning left to right up here. Similarly, you've got the wall panels. Again, make it a bit bigger for you. So they're spanning, because the height of the building was too high for a single panel, we've had to put a joint at that particular height. So in this case, 11.48 meters was the height of a single panel. And then we finish it off with another small panel at the top and have a connection in there. So that connection needs a fair amount of thinking about, because it was self-supporting. So the girt is about halfway up, and it has to span from the ground to the girt and then up to the eaves beam as well. And we see a little bit of bracing in there. This is the elevation on the staging area. And so we've got lots of doors in there. So the external walls, again, were lined using these panels. Here is an elevation looking at the inside of the freezer. So in here we have the main freezer, and this is what we call a blast freezer. So pallets of food bring in here, and they can be quickly reduced in temperature as well. Here is typical wall to floor joint, and this is typical for a freezer. Let's blow that up a bit. And so here is the slab, the structural slab, that would go in as normal. But then you need a layer of insulation and then a wearing slab for your chiller or your freezer as well. And if there is a temperature difference between one side and the other, which there usually will be in this situation, you need to put a thermal break or a conduction cut in the panel. And if the panel is lightly loaded, the PIR can normally take the compression force on its own. However, if the loading is quite high, you need to make sure that this connection here is able to carry the load and transmit it into the concrete upstand. So again, here's a typical wall-to-floor joint, which is an intermediate. Let's blow it up a bit. Let's have a look. So we're connecting directly onto the wearing slab, again, which is concrete, which is laid over your DPM and your polystyrene floor insulation. The panel is connected to the floor using 40 by 40, in this case, steel angles, and connected using rivets as well. Again, a typical wall-to-floor joint, similar to the one we've seen before. We've got a blast freezer on one side, a conduction cut again, and then looking at the rivets we need to connect this wall to that one as well. On this side, the wall can go straight down and transmit the load into the structural slab below. Here's a typical ceiling joint. So the purlins were 300 PFCs in this case. And we just simply had a strap and a bracket. The purpose made for this situation. So you put a mushroom-headed bolt on either side of the joint to carry those panels. Here is a typical wall-to-ceiling junction where basically the ceiling panel sits on top of the wall panel, and we tidy it up by putting some angles around the outside. Sometimes the step is slightly varied, but basically you are trying to isolate the steel sheets from the outside world as well. So in effect, this forms a thermal break as well. And again, where we've got, this is a horizontal section through a wall junction. And again, if there's a difference between the temperatures on each side of the wall, we would want a cut in the external or the continuous skin, which could potentially conduct the temperature from one side to the other. Now, in this distribution center, the air was ducted through panels forming a duct. And so these were suspended from the ceiling panels. So we had thin PIR structurally insulated panels suspended from the PIR structurally insulated panels, which formed the ceiling. So we basically had drop rods and mushroom threaded bolts as well. Because there was no connection on here, every now and then we had to put in a restraining bracket or a support bracket to the side walls as well. And the side ducts were also formed using the PIR structurally insulated panels as well. So this is the connection. The typical arrangement for a warehouse is you have a precast concrete panel up to what I call a dado height. You have a girt supporting or restraining that, and then on top of that we can build our duct. Above that you've then got steel cladding supporting on light gauge steel girts. There are various means of supporting the ceiling panels. You can either do it through drop rods or brackets and straps hooked over the purlins above as well. So this is what it looks like in the pretty much near the finished product. You'll notice this is the staging area. So these are the doors for it and the dock load levelers on that side. You'll notice the whole thing is sprinklered. The whole building had an awful lot of sprinklers, and that makes a big difference to the loading that you're taking on these panels. In most of the cases, the sprinklers and the pipes were supported on the SIPS panels as well. A little closer detail of the doors in that staging area too. Then this is the doors to the freezer. So they basically had automated roller shutter doors, and the big barriers there to stop the forklift trucks running into the doors on the side. This is a view on the inside of the blast freezer, so it's not being taken down to its freezing low temperature as yet, but you'll see it's pretty typical insulated panels on a perimeter concrete upstand, and SIPS panels acting as the ceiling. This is what the top of the staging area looks like. So we've got our structural steel frame as a warehouse, and then we have steelwork supporting the ceiling, and we've got drop rods supporting the panels as well. And these are all the sprinkler pipes running through it. This is what the inside of the freezer looks like, and it basically looks like a big store, because it is. And you have racks basically more or less floor up to eaves level. And once it's in operation, those will be full of, in this case, food. Another view of the inside of the freezer, give you an idea of the scale of the building we're looking at. So some very large buildings can be used, built using these panels. Inside the warehouse, there was a chilled storage area, and this is again a typical arrangement with, here we can see the panels spanning from floor to the ceiling of the chilled storage area, and we have some girts to support it. In this case, the structure was all on the outside of the room. It's a relatively small room, so this is basically a building within a building as well. Down here we have a freezer again, but it's quite small, so therefore it's entirely self-supporting. There's no structure other than the SIPS to support these small buildings. So this can be done when the size of the building is quite small. So this is the outside of the same cool store. So we basically have an external steel frame braced with reed bracing and so forth. And this is the upper portion of it. So it's effectively 2 stories high. And so here is our effectively a purlin supporting the ceiling panels of that warehouse as well. So typical joints. In this case, you can have mitre joints. So this is effectively one panel meeting another panel, and when we finish it off as a mitre joint with some angles riveted to the skins of the PIR panels. Similar, we do a wall to a ceiling joint, and we can finish that off with a flashing. So in simple issues, we can just plonk the ceiling panel on top of the wall. Where we want to fix the wall panel to the steelwork, we can have through bolts connected via specially made brackets to hook on to, in this case, a PFC. Similarly, at the mid-height, we can have through bolts connecting to these brackets which hook on to the flanges of the PFC. So those are typical wall panel fixing details. And further details of that. So in some cases, the PFC was on its side, so you hook right around the flange for this particular case with our mushroom-headed bolts. And to keep things smooth, we put in a PVC spacer tube through the panel, and that allows the bolt to pass straight through to the other side. Some more wall fixing details. Where we needed a bit more grunts, a bracket that went from top to bottom, and we had 2 bolts basically, and that wrapped around the PFC. So this is what a through bolt looks like before it's put through your panel. So it has a plastic mushroom head to cover up the steel head, plastic sleeve to pass through the panel, and on the other side you have a washer and a bolt to connect it, and then you can tie it into a bracket or whatever you need to tie it into as well. This is another job. This was actually a trafficable ceiling, and this was in call it a medical facility. It was basically a drug producing factory. So rather than cooking it up at home and setting fire to the kitchen, they decided to make a full pharmaceutical manufacturing lab. And they did this inside an existing warehouse. So by converting an existing warehouse into medical facilities. And one of their requirements was to have a trafficable ceiling above, because there's lots and lots of services coming in from above, and they didn't want any fixings from below. So all of these panels had to be suspended from above. And that's what the finished product looks like. So they were suspended on cables from the steelwork way above, using these, what I call the secret fixings. And you'll see how much the services are in this facility. Lots and lots of air ducts and filters and so forth. A bit clearer view of the suspended cables and the brackets for the secret fixings before most of the services went in. Closer view of that as well. So we end up with adjustable rods, threaded rods that can be adjusted to the height. And this is what the underside of the ceiling looked like during construction. So no observable fixings from underneath as well. And this is before they started putting all the holes in it. So we had this nice big ceiling with nothing interrupting it until they started cutting lots and lots of holes in those panels. And the holes were for these type of things, the fans coming through the ceiling into the rooms below. In some cases where we had a ceiling joint that could be exposed outside of the clean room facilities, we could use the detail we've done before with through bolts. This through bolt detail wasn't allowed in the clean room areas. So we use these secret fixings. And so we developed brackets that sit in between the joints of the SIPS panels and bolted directly onto the steelwork above. This is an exploded view of the secret, what I call the secret fixings. And so it's basically a channel that fits in the joint between the two panels. And then you have hangers screwed to that channel, and then suspension cables in there. Okay, so this is what the secret fixing actually looked like in practice. Make that a bit bigger. So you'll see it's a relatively thin channel which goes between the folded ends of the steel skins. That makes it a nice rigid joint. And then you screw the bracket, the steel bracket for the suspension cable. Another view of that secret fixing. So for further reading on cool rooms, there's an old practice note, number 15 from iPens. I believe that is still available. And for more details, you can look at the Conqueror cool room panel details for the profiles and specifications as well. Design-wise, these two guides we've mentioned before. So there's one which is basically from Germany and another one from Russia. Those basically available for download from the internet. So here are the URLs to go to those websites as well. And of course, the Metalcraft website itself has many, many details you can download and use in your projects. So that was part 3. Looking forward to part 4 in 2 weeks' time. We'll be looking at some more technical details, more Mathcad on the capacity of fixings. Just a reminder of the YouTube channel. Comes under the name of Daddy Pig. So if you search for Daddy Pig 6354, you'll find all of these recorded CPD seminars. Check out the YouTube channel for previous recordings. And so I've already put up seminar 16 and seminar 17, which are part 1 and part 2 of this series of 5 on structural insulated panels. So if you click on that, don't forget to like and share, and maybe even subscribe to the channel.